Amidst the bustling crowd of New York's subway station, Carlos, a quiet security guard, notices an elderly woman holding a wilted bouquet, waiting for someone who has not appeared for days. When he decides to uncover the truth, Carlos has no idea that this act will profoundly change both his life and hers. Who is she waiting for? And will Carlos be able to confront the painful secrets hidden behind those expectant eyes? Follow along to discover this emotional and suspenseful story where friendship and compassion touch the deepest corners of the heart. Don't miss this heartfelt journey. Stay tuned so you won't miss any of the upcoming developments. In the early morning in New York, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the towering skyscrapers, casting light onto the busy streets and the noisy subway station. The murmur of train engines, the repetitive announcements, and the city's hurried rhythm created an environment that was both vibrant and distant. This was just another typical morning for Carlos Santiago, a 32-year-old subway security guard. He had been working here for nearly 6 years, and the hustle and bustle had become an ingrained part of his memory. Carlos was an excellent observer. Every morning before starting his shift, he spent a few minutes standing in his usual spot, sipping coffee and watching the stream of people pass by a living gallery of life stories. He often recognized familiar passengers, early commuters, diligent students, and even new faces. But that morning, when his eyes stopped at a waiting area near the train entrance, an unusual sight caught his attention and held it. There, amidst the ebb and flow of the crowd, sat an elderly woman, likely in her 70s, quietly on a bench. Later, Carlos would learn her name was Sophie. She stood out starkly from the hurried passengers around her. Sitting with perfect posture, neatly dressed in an old brown coat and a dark wool scarf, she held a bouquet of tulips that had already begun to wilt. The flowers seemed odd on a cold winter morning when no one would typically bring blooms to such a crowded and chilly place as a subway station. As Carlos observed her, he felt a pang of recognition, a shared familiarity with solitude in the long, monotonous days at work. For him, talking to someone or connecting was rare, so seeing the elderly woman sitting alone, with eyes shadowed by sadness, evoked in him a deep sense of empathy. Maybe she's waiting for someone, Carlos thought, almost as a comfort to himself, because seeing someone alone, surrounded by yet detached from a crowd, always made him wonder. After his lunch break, Carlos returned to the waiting area and was surprised to find the woman still there. The morning crowd had changed, early commuters had given way to the bustling midday throng, but Sophie remained, sitting quietly as if sculpted from stone. He decided to walk past her for a closer look. Carlos noticed her eyes remained fixed, as if she was searching for someone in the sea of faces. There was anticipation in her gaze, but it was mixed with a hint of worry. By the end of his shift, Carlos was surprised to see that the elderly woman was still there. He hesitated, wondering if he should approach her. He wasn't sure if he was getting too involved in the life of a stranger, but Sophie's presence made him feel an inexplicable unease. Something was off. A woman sitting all day at a subway station, with no one showing up, no phone calls. Carlos decided that he would keep an eye on her again the next day. On his way home, the image of Sophie lingered in Carlos's mind. He wondered if the person she was waiting for would ever come. Was this just a peculiar encounter between an elderly person and a younger man, or was it the start of a larger story? The sight of the wilted tulips stirred a nameless sadness in him, a sense of loss he couldn't quite define. The next day, Carlos arrived at the station earlier than usual. He stopped at his usual coffee stand and ordered a hot cappuccino, hoping to find some answers to his questions from the day before. Unlike his normal routine, Carlos felt restless, thinking about Sophie and wondering if she would return to that same bench. As he anticipated, when he reached the waiting area, Sophie was there, sitting on the same old bench. Today, the tulips in her hands appeared even more withered than the day before. There was something in her eyes deep, filled with anticipation, but also tinged with barely concealed disappointment. Carlos decided to approach and start a conversation. Carlos took a deep breath, ready to break the silence. He walked over and leaned slightly forward, speaking politely yet warmly. "Hello, ma'am, I'm Carlos, the security guard here. I noticed you've been sitting here since yesterday. Are you waiting for someone?" Sophie looked up, her eyes brightening a bit at the sound of his friendly voice. She gave a gentle smile. "Oh, thank you for asking. Yes, I am waiting for a friend. A very special friend." Carlos was surprised by the honesty in her voice. The sincerity and quiet longing in her eyes stirred something in him. He sat down beside her, cautiously yet kindly, so as not to make her uncomfortable. After a few minutes of small talk, Sophie began to open up. She told Carlos about Walter, an old friend from her youth. They had known each other since they were young and shared many beautiful memories, but life had led them down separate paths. After many years apart, they had reconnected through social media. Sophie spoke with a voice that was soft and sorrowful, but tinged with hope. He said he would come here, that he wanted to see me again. We promised each other that we would do the things we never got to do when we were young. Carlos felt his heart grow heavy as he listened to her words. The image of an elderly woman waiting for a friend from the past moved him deeply. He tried not to show his doubts, but inside, questions swirled. How could someone like Sophie, clearly advanced in years, wait at a subway station for 2 days just to meet an old friend? Carlos asked cautiously, "Are you sure he's coming today? I mean, could the train have been delayed, or could something have come up?" Sophie paused briefly, then replied softly, "He texted me yesterday saying he would come. But then he said the train was delayed, and today I believe he'll be here, even if it's a bit late." Carlos frowned slightly. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about Sophie waiting 2 whole days. The uncertainty in Walter's messages made him anxious. He wondered if Sophie might be placing her faith in something unrealistic. He decided to shift the conversation to make her feel more at ease. As they talked, Carlos shared a bit about himself. He told Sophie about his life, how he had been working as a subway security guard since he was young. Carlos also mentioned that he once had a close friend, but they lost touch after that friend moved to another city. He knew what it felt like to lose someone and to wait, which perhaps explained why he felt such empathy for Sophie. Sophie listened, her eyes reflecting a sense of shared understanding. She said, "It's rare for someone as young as you to understand this feeling. In our times, finding someone who truly listens is hard." Their conversation was brief, but a bond was clearly starting to form. Carlos felt a sense of comfort when the elderly woman looked at him with warmth. As their chat wound down, Carlos offered, "Would you like me to check the train schedule for you, or ask someone to look into it? You don't have to wait like this." But Sophie simply shook her head and smiled. "Thank you, Carlos. I'm sure he'll be here soon. It's just a minor setback." Carlos walked away, still feeling uneasy. Before leaving the station, he glanced back one more time at Sophie, who remained seated quietly, her hand gently touching the dried tulip petals. An unsettling feeling gnawed at him, urging him that he needed to do something to help her. Carlos went home with the image of the elderly woman and the story of her old friend lingering in his mind. He resolved to find a way to help her the next day, as his intuition told him the story was more complicated than she let on. And maybe he wanted to learn more about the woman who had stirred a special empathy in him that he had never felt before. The next day, Carlos arrived earlier than usual, determined to learn more about Sophie's story. The crowd was still bustling as ever, but today he didn't feel rushed or treat his job as mere routine. Something had shifted within him since meeting Sophie, a sense of urgency to help someone he found endearing and relatable. Carlos quickly navigated through the crowd, his eyes scanning the waiting area, and he breathed a sigh of relief when he saw Sophie sitting on the familiar bench. Today, she wasn't holding the bouquet of tulips. Instead, a small bag rested on her lap, with a few sheets of paper peeking out. This piqued Carlos's curiosity even more, as he felt it might be a clue to better understand her situation. He walked over and greeted her with his warm, familiar smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Sophie. No tulip bouquet today." Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes showing a hint of hesitation, and replied, "I thought it might not be worth bringing them anymore, since so many days have passed. But I'm still waiting." Carlos furrowed his brow, deciding he needed to do more to help her. He spoke gently, "Mrs. Sophie, if you don't mind, could I help check on Mr. Walter's train? Do you have any details like the train number?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, but then she opened her bag and handed Carlos a piece of paper with a printed message from her phone, detailing Walter's promise to come by train from a small town in the south, along with some notes about the station. Carlos took the paper and read the message. Almost immediately, he noticed something strange in how Walter described his journey. The message lacked a train number and did not clearly specify an arrival time. Carlos knew that for such a long trip, providing detailed information was essential, especially when someone like Sophie was waiting from afar. He asked softly, "Are you sure Mr. Walter gave you accurate details about his arrival time?" Sophie shook her head. He said the train might be delayed but assured me he'd be here within a few days. You know, sometimes people our age forget the little details. Carlos felt uneasy. The story seemed to grow more ambiguous, and he decided he needed to investigate further. He wondered if Sophie was being misled or even deceived. Carlos excused himself for a moment and went to the security office to check the train information system. After a few minutes of searching, he realized that no trains from the town Walter mentioned had been delayed at any time during the past week. A feeling of alarm rose within him, and Carlos returned to Sophie, this time with genuine concern. When Carlos returned, he began to ask more about Walter. He inquired about when she and Walter had reconnected, why Walter only sent messages instead of calling, and the details of the other messages she had received. Sophie sat silently, her eyes growing distant as she recalled, "We started reconnecting over a year ago through social media. Walter said he was living alone and that his health had recently declined. We talked a lot about the past, about the dreams we once had when we were young. That's why I wanted to see him again, to fulfill those unfinished dreams together." Carlos could feel the sadness in her voice. It seemed as if she had nurtured these feelings for years, and now, in her old age, that fragile hope had become the only thing keeping her going each day. As he listened and talked with her further, Carlos found more inconsistencies. The vagueness of the messages and the unclear information from Walter reminded him of stories he'd heard about scams. He decided to dig deeper, maybe even contact some friends in the field to verify Walter's identity. Before leaving, Carlos advised Sophie to stay at the station for another day. He promised to do everything he could to find out more about the train's status and made a suggestion: "Mrs. Sophie, if anything unusual happens, please call me. Don't hesitate." Sophie looked at him, hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, her eyes shimmering with hope. Perhaps she could see the sincerity and determination in Carlos's gaze. As Carlos left the station, a growing sense of unease filled him. He resolved to delve into this story not just as a duty of a security guard but out of genuine compassion. The thought of a kind, lonely elderly woman being deceived when she most needed comfort and trust was unbearable to him. Carlos told himself that if this was a scam, he would do everything in his power to protect Sophie. On his way home, he began formulating a plan, checking Walter's identity through various sources and talking to colleagues for more verification. To Carlos, this was no longer just helping a stranger, it was a promise to protect someone he had come to care about. That evening, after leaving the station, Carlos couldn't shake Sophie's story from his mind. It felt less like a simple task and more like a personal mission. His instincts and the ambiguous details he had observed convinced him that something was amiss. Carlos decided to dig deeper. He wanted to know if Walter really existed. Carlos remembered an old friend who worked in the anti-fraud unit at the NYPD, and he reached out to ask for help. Through a few exchanged messages, his friend agreed to assist Carlos in tracking down information about Walter based on what Sophie had shared. A few days later, while working at the station, Carlos received a message from his friend, accompanied by a set of information. His anxiety rose as he opened the message. His friend informed him that there was no one named Walter Smith in the city Sophie mentioned, especially not someone matching the age she described. Even more troubling, Carlos discovered that there had been a string of similar scams targeting the elderly in New York, using fabricated romantic stories to defraud them. The name Walter had appeared in a few prior scam reports. Carlos gripped his phone tightly, fully aware that Sophie might be the target of a major scam. He knew it would be difficult to reveal this truth to her without shattering her. Sophie wasn't just waiting for a friend, she was holding on to what might be the last emotional anchor she had faith in. Carlos felt torn between protecting the truth and showing compassion for Sophie. He wondered, should he tell her everything right away? How could she face this reality without losing faith in people? Carlos knew that while he couldn't change the past, he could try to shield her from future pain. In the end, Carlos decided not to tell her immediately. He wanted more evidence and needed to find the best way to approach her so she wouldn't feel too betrayed or devastated. He resolved to handle the situation delicately and thoughtfully. The next morning, Carlos met Sophie at the station. She sat quietly, staring into the distance as the trains came and went, her eyes filled with an unmistakable sadness. Carlos sat down beside her and inquired about Walter in a gentle manner. He cautiously suggested, "Mrs. Sophie, I looked into the train that Mr. Walter mentioned. It seems there hasn't been any such delayed train. Are you sure he still talks to you and keeps in touch?" Sophie nodded, her eyes gleaming with hope. Yes, of course, Carlos. He messages me almost every day, saying he'll come see me soon. I think there might have been some trouble, or maybe his health isn't good, so I'll wait a few more days. Carlos felt a pang in his heart at her patience and faith. He couldn't deny that Sophie truly believed in Walter's story. This wasn't just a simple expectation, it was her source of comfort, and the only hope she had in her later years. Each word she spoke deepened Carlos's conflict. He wanted to protect her, but couldn't just crush her dreams outright. Carlos decided to be more cautious and gather more concrete evidence before revealing the whole truth. He subtly asked for more details about the messages Walter sent and suggested that it might be helpful for Sophie to have a recent photo of Walter for identification. He explained that this could assist the station's management in helping her if needed. Sophie looked surprised but admitted that she didn't have any pictures of Walter, apart from her memories of a long-ago friend. Walter had never sent any personal photos, which Sophie still found quite normal. She believed he was simply shy. That night, Carlos couldn't stop thinking about Sophie and her story. He called his friend at the police department, asking him to investigate further into the phone numbers and accounts Walter had been using to message Sophie. His friend agreed, but cautioned that it would take a few more days to gather comprehensive information. Carlos became increasingly worried about Sophie. He feared that if she continued to believe in this story, the emotional toll would be devastating. And if Walter was indeed just a con artist, it wouldn't just be her trust that was betrayed, but the precious hope she had nurtured for so long. Carlos realized that this was not just Sophie's story, it was a lesson for him as well about loneliness and how vulnerable a person can become when longing for someone's care. Sophie's image made him feel a deep sense of responsibility, and he promised himself he would not let her fall into further harm or heartbreak. Carlos had never felt such a strong connection to a stranger before. But this time he knew he couldn't turn away. Sophie had awakened a sense of humanity and compassion in him that he thought had faded amid the city's relentless pace. The next morning, as soon as Carlos arrived at the station, his phone rang. On the other end was his friend from the police, who he'd asked for help. With a serious tone, his friend reported that they had identified the person behind the Walter account and uncovered significant details. His friend revealed that the phone number Walter had been using didn't belong to an individual but was a spoofed number registered under a company overseas. The scammer had used multiple accounts with different fake identities, targeting elderly, lonely individuals to build virtual relationships and exploit them financially. Carlos listened to this news, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. The image of Sophie came to his mind. She had nurtured her feelings and hopes, waiting alone for days just to meet someone who had never existed. Carlos felt heartbroken and torn. How could he shatter the final dream she had believed in? But if he didn't tell her, she could continue to suffer. Carlos decided he would meet Sophie during his lunch break and have an honest conversation. He knew it wouldn't be an easy decision, but for her safety and dignity, he needed to help her face the truth. Finding Sophie on the familiar bench, Carlos approached, took a deep breath, and sat down beside her. He began to speak, trying to find the right way to ease her into the truth so she wouldn't be too shocked. "Mrs. Sophie, I have something to share with you, but please don't worry too much. Can you trust me?" Sophie nodded, her eyes sad but filled with the trust she had in Carlos. She looked at him expectantly, as if she already sensed that something was wrong. Carlos clenched his hands to steady himself and continued, "Mrs. Sophie, I asked a friend to help look into some information about Mr. Walter. The truth is, there was no delayed train, and there isn't anyone named Walter coming from that place to see you." Sophie froze, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She looked at Carlos, her eyes reflecting disbelief, and shook her head. "Carlos, there must be some mistake. He's been messaging me all the time." Carlos sighed, summoning all his courage to go on. "Mrs. Sophie, those messages are from an imposter. I'm so sorry to say this, but the person you've been talking to isn't really Walter. He's a scammer who has been taking advantage of your trust and affection." Sophie sat in silence, her eyes clouding over as she struggled to absorb Carlos's words. Her heart seemed to break, and the fragile dream she had nurtured for so long began to crumble. At first, Sophie couldn't believe what she was hearing. She looked at Carlos, her eyes filled with disappointment and pain. "No, that can't be. You must be mistaken, Carlos. Walter wouldn't do that. We've been talking for over a year. He knows everything about me." Carlos tried to keep his voice soft and comforting. I know this is very hard to accept, but it's the truth. This scammer has exploited your kindness and sincerity, but I promise you won't have to face this alone. Sophie gazed down at the floor, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had never imagined that the old friend she'd been waiting for didn't exist. It was all just a cruel trick, and she felt as though she had lost a piece of her life. Carlos placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling her tremble. He knew his responsibility wasn't just to reveal the truth but also to comfort her and help her get through this pain. He said, "This isn't your fault, Mrs. Sophie. Sometimes people take advantage of others' trust, but I'll be here for you and we'll get through this together." Sophie nodded slightly, trying to hold back her sobs and managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for not abandoning me. Maybe I was too naive." After their tearful conversation, Carlos resolved to help Sophie rediscover her life and find happiness again. He thought about encouraging her to join community clubs for the elderly so she wouldn't feel lonely anymore. He also planned to contact organizations that provided emotional support to help her gradually recover from the shock. Carlos realized he wasn't just a security guard anymore, he had become a real friend to Sophie. From now on, he would be her support and wouldn't let her face this hardship alone. As Carlos left, he saw Sophie sitting quietly, but this time without the look of expectation, there was acceptance instead. He felt a sense of relief, knowing that at least he had helped her face the truth and would not let her suffer alone. He promised himself he would do everything to protect her, not just from scammers but from loneliness itself. Because sometimes a little care and human connection are exactly what someone needs to get through the hardest days. After that tearful conversation and the painful revelations, Sophie took a short time to accept and face the fact that Walter was just an illusion. However, Carlos's kindness and presence helped her move through the sadness more quickly. Each day, Carlos made time to check in on her when they saw each other at the station, which gradually lifted her spirits. But Carlos knew that for Sophie to truly move on, she needed to find joy and purpose again. One afternoon, Carlos decided to take another step to help Sophie. He sat down beside her at the station, looking at her with a warm smile and said, "Mrs. Sophie, I think that besides meeting here each day, we should try something new to make you feel happier. Would you like to try joining a club or maybe a support group for seniors?" Sophie looked at him, momentarily puzzled. Joining community activities wasn't something she had ever considered. For a long time, she had been accustomed to a quiet, closed-off life, and the idea of participating in group activities felt strange. However, Carlos's eyes were full of hope, and she felt as if she could trust him. "Carlos, I don't know if I would fit in those places. I've been living alone for so long." Carlos smiled encouragingly. "We can start slowly, don't worry. There's a senior club nearby that holds fun gatherings. They play chess, do crafts, and sometimes even organize little trips around the city. I think you'd enjoy it." After some persuasion, Sophie finally agreed to try visiting the senior club Carlos suggested. Carlos arranged an afternoon to take her there. When they arrived, Sophie felt a bit nervous, but the warm welcome from the other members soon put her at ease. New friends invited her to play chess and join a painting session. Watching her from a distance, Carlos felt relieved and happy to see Sophie smile again. It was a gentle smile full of newfound joy, and for the first time in months, Carlos felt that he had truly done something meaningful. He decided he would take her to the club weekly until she gained more confidence. During subsequent club meetings, Sophie began to share more about her life with Carlos. She spoke of memories with her husband, who had passed away long ago, and their dreams of traveling together after retirement. But her husband had died young, and since then she had lived a quiet, closed-off life, never fulfilling any of those dreams. Reconnecting with Walter had been her way of feeling tied to the past and those unfinished dreams. Carlos listened with deep empathy. He realized that Sophie hadn't just lost Walter, she had lost her final hopes for a life filled with meaning. Her story made him reflect on his own life, recognizing that he, too, had been living in a closed-off way and had forgotten to seek true joy. A few weeks later, Carlos took Sophie to a public garden in the city where small gardening classes were held for seniors. For the first time, Sophie tried planting flowers and felt as carefree as a child. Carlos was amazed to see her so lively and happy in that moment. "Thank you, Carlos. Thanks to you, I've realized there are still so many beautiful things in life to discover," Sophie said. Carlos smiled, his heart feeling warmer than ever. "Mrs. Sophie, you don't know it, but you're helping me too." Seeing you happy makes my life feel more meaningful. After their outings together, Sophie and Carlos grew closer, their friendship deepening. They found in each other a source of inspiration and renewed motivation. Sophie began attending club gatherings with more confidence, and Carlos realized that these meetings not only helped her but brought joy and a sense of connection to his own life as well. They shared many beautiful moments during those days, from playing chess and watching movies to watching the sunset in the park together. Carlos gradually came to see Sophie as family, and Sophie found in Carlos the joy and comfort that had eluded her for so long. On Saturday morning, Carlos arrived early to pick up Sophie for a flower exhibition at Central Park. Sophie had prepared carefully, wearing a bright coat and a wide-brimmed hat. She seemed more excited than ever. This was the first time in years that life felt colorful to her, thanks to her outings with Carlos. Carlos and Sophie strolled along the paths lined with vibrant flowers. Sophie delightedly admired the colorful blooms, pausing occasionally to marvel at a rare species or inhale the soft fragrance of freshly blossomed clusters. Carlos watched her and felt his heart warm with shared happiness. He realized that these simple moments brought him a joy he hadn't felt in a long time. While they were exploring, Sophie suddenly stopped when she saw a bush of purple hydrangeas, her eyes distant and dreamy. Carlos noticed her reminiscing and gently asked, "Mrs. Sophie, do hydrangeas have a special meaning for you?" Sophie smiled softly, her eyes lighting up as she recalled fond memories. "My husband loved hydrangeas. He would often bring me a small bouquet on special occasions. Seeing them reminds me of him and the happy days we shared." Carlos listened in silence, feeling the tender longing in her voice. Those cherished memories were not just a source of sadness but a strength that kept her going. As they continued their visit, Carlos and Sophie met a middle-aged woman named Maria, who was also a member of the club Sophie attended. Maria introduced herself cheerfully and invited Sophie to join a craft class for seniors. Initially, Sophie was hesitant, but with Maria's friendliness and Carlos's encouragement, she agreed. That same week, Sophie and Maria attended the class together. There, Sophie began learning how to make decorative items from paper and fabric, something she had never tried before. She felt excited and energized as she created small, beautiful crafts. Carlos was pleased to see Sophie becoming more open and willing to engage in new activities. Just as their lives seemed to be settling into a happy routine, an unexpected incident occurred. One day, when Carlos arrived at Sophie's house to take her to meet some friends, he discovered that she had fallen in the bathroom. She had felt a bit dizzy and slipped, making Carlos worry immensely. Carlos immediately took her to the hospital for a checkup. Fortunately, she wasn't seriously injured, but the doctor recommended that she limit her movement for a while and have someone assist her at home. This incident left them both feeling unsettled. Carlos knew how independent Sophie was and realized that accepting help wouldn't be easy for her. Carlos thought a lot about Sophie's condition and decided he would spend more time with her during her recovery. He offered to come by every day after work to help with dinner preparations and house chores. At first, Sophie was hesitant and felt embarrassed about accepting help. But after seeing Carlos's dedication and thoughtfulness, she accepted it with gratitude. During this period, Sophie not only had the chance to grow closer to Carlos but also shared many stories and life lessons. The two became true friends, and Carlos's presence became a great source of comfort to her in her solitary days. One quiet evening, while Carlos was preparing dinner, Sophie sat nearby and began to share her thoughts. "Carlos, I used to think that old age was just about waiting and facing losses. But thanks to you, I've realized that life still has so much to offer, no matter how old we are." Carlos paused, listened, and responded, "Mrs. Sophie, you've taught me so much about patience and appreciating the small moments. Life may not be easy, but thanks to you, I've learned to find joy in simple things." They sat together, soaking in the meaning of friendship and companionship. Carlos felt that his life was no longer as empty as it once was, and Sophie realized that while age brought loneliness, she could still find joy through genuine friendships. After this challenging time, Sophie gradually recovered, and with Carlos's help, she returned to her activities at the club and resumed meeting friends. The two began planning small outings, such as visiting parks or attending community events. Their friendship was no longer just about assistance but had grown into a strong, meaningful relationship. Carlos recognized that because of Sophie, he had gained new values and purpose in life. He no longer worked just to make a living. He felt like he was truly living, driven by something greater and more meaningful. After months of recovery and the joy of shared activities, Carlos decided to plan a short trip with Sophie. It wasn't a long journey, but a visit to a small seaside town a few hours by train from the city. For Carlos, this was a way to give Sophie a new experience and help her create more beautiful memories. When Carlos suggested the idea, Sophie was surprised and delighted. It had been so long since she had traveled anywhere, and the thought made her feel as excited as a child. She began to prepare meticulously, choosing her outfits and packing the essentials. Carlos was equally enthusiastic, making thorough preparations, from booking train tickets to planning the itinerary to ensure the trip would be perfect. Early that morning, Carlos arrived at Sophie's apartment to pick her up. She looked youthful and full of energy in her warm coat and knitted hat, carrying a small bag. They made their way to the train station, and Carlos noticed that Sophie's smile was brighter than ever. For the first time in many years, she felt genuine excitement about leaving the city, and Carlos was happy to have brought her this joy. On the train, they sat by the window, taking in the scenery outside. Sophie shared memories of her past travels, times when she and her husband visited various places and created countless beautiful moments. Carlos listened, feeling the warmth and optimism in her voice. He understood that these stories were not just distant memories but an essential part of who Sophie was. When the train arrived, they wandered around the small town. The seaside town had a serene beauty with white sandy beaches and little houses lined up along the shore. Sophie's eyes lit up as she saw the ocean. She hadn't seen it in a very long time. They walked barefoot along the beach, letting the waves touch their feet. Sophie laughed heartily as if life had never held any sadness, and Carlos felt his heart swell with happiness seeing her so carefree. They stopped at a small seaside cafe. Sophie gazed out at the sea, her eyes glistening. She took a sip of warm coffee and said to Carlos, "Carlos, without you, I would never have had this beautiful moment. Thank you so much for bringing me this joy." Carlos smiled and replied, "Mrs. Sophie, I should be thanking you too. You've helped me realize the simple, meaningful things in life. I think this trip isn't just for you, it's a gift for me as well." That afternoon, as they enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere, Sophie suddenly felt a bit tired. Carlos immediately grew concerned. He took her to a nearby clinic for a health check. Although it turned out to be just fatigue from all the walking, Carlos couldn't help but feel a bit fearful. He realized that his feelings for Sophie had deepened. She was like the only family he wanted to protect. After the doctor confirmed there was nothing serious, Carlos felt relieved, and they returned to their hotel to rest. On the way back, Sophie held Carlos's hand, smiled, and said, "You don't have to worry so much, Carlos. I'm so happy to have you by my side. Life may still hold challenges, but I think I'm ready to face them, as long as I have a good friend like you." Carlos was moved, feeling warmth spread through his heart. Sophie's words gave him strength and courage. In that moment, he realized that their relationship had become something far deeper than he had ever imagined. It was more than empathy or kindness, it was true affection, it was family he had found. That evening, Carlos and Sophie decided to return to the beach. They sat on the sand, gazing up at the star-filled sky. The night sea brought an extraordinary sense of peace and tranquility. They sat side by side, savoring the quiet moments without needing to say a word. Carlos felt as though every sadness and loneliness within him had been erased. Sophie felt as if she were reliving her youth, a time when life was full of dreams and hope. She turned to Carlos and said softly, "Carlos, even though we were just strangers who met by chance, I believe that this encounter has brought comfort to both of us. I hope you'll always be happy and live fully." Carlos took her hand and nodded. "I wish the same for you, Mrs. Sophie. You've taught me so much, and I believe that our meeting has changed my life." The trip ended with beautiful memories that both would cherish forever. Carlos took Sophie home, his heart full of gratitude and happiness. He realized that family doesn't have to be defined by blood, it can be anyone willing to share and walk alongside each other, even in the simplest moments. After this trip, both Carlos and Sophie understood that they had become a true family to each other. To Sophie, Carlos was not just a friend but someone who brought new life, meaning, and joy. And to Carlos, Mrs. Sophie was the one who had helped him find purpose and happiness in life. After the trip, they returned to their daily lives in the city. However, the experience had left a profound impact on them both. They had found not only joy and connection but also the value of ordinary moments. Carlos continued to visit Sophie regularly, and they spent a lot of time together, from having tea to strolling in the nearby park. Sophie participated in the senior club with more enthusiasm. She felt more confident and shared her stories with new friends. Seeing her vibrant and happy again, Carlos felt reassured and delighted. Each time he saw Sophie smiling and at ease, he knew he had helped her rediscover genuine joy. One evening, while Carlos was preparing dinner at home, he received a call from a relative he hadn't been in touch with for a long time, an uncle who had moved to another state when Carlos was very young. The uncle called to let him know that he was coming back to the city and wanted to see Carlos, having heard about his recent life through other family members. The phone call caught Carlos by surprise. While he was happy to know a relative wanted to reconnect, he felt a bit apprehensive because of his independent and somewhat secluded life. He wasn't sure he was ready to open up to his family after so many years apart. But after reflecting on what he'd learned from Sophie, Carlos decided he would try to embrace this opportunity to connect with his family. Carlos told Sophie about the call, and she encouraged him. Carlos' family is such an important part of life. Welcome them and give them a chance to know you better. You'll feel happier and more fulfilled for it. Carlos nodded, realizing the wisdom in Sophie's advice. He understood that he had grown significantly since meeting her and wanted to make an effort to connect with his family. One weekend, Carlos went to visit Sophie as usual. But this time he noticed that she seemed unwell. She was sitting in her chair, looking pale, and he could see the signs of fatigue on her face. He quickly took her to the hospital for a thorough checkup. The doctor diagnosed her with blood pressure issues and advised that she needed more rest and should avoid strenuous activities. Carlos sat beside her in the hospital, holding her hand tightly and reassuring her, "Mrs. Sophie, don't worry, I'll always be here for you. You just need to rest and take care of yourself." Sophie gave him a weak smile, but her eyes shone with trust and calmness. Although she knew that aging brought health challenges, she felt reassured knowing Carlos would always be by her side. In the following days, Carlos visited and took care of Sophie frequently. He helped with everything from cooking and cleaning to assisting her with light exercises. Gradually, Sophie's health began to improve, but Carlos continued to be attentive and supportive. They both felt their relationship deepen, becoming a bond as strong as family. One evening, as they sat together, Sophie said to Carlos, "Carlos, you're the most cherished friend I've ever had. My life has changed so much because of you, and I feel so lucky to have you by my side." Carlos smiled and held her hand. "Mrs. Sophie, I feel lucky too. You're not just a friend, you're family to me. Everything we've been through together will always be precious memories in my life." Inspired by Sophie, Carlos decided to open up more with his family. He invited his uncle over for dinner and shared stories about his life, work, and special friends like Sophie. She had become an inseparable part of Carlos's life story, and he felt proud to share their beautiful friendship. The meeting with his uncle helped Carlos appreciate the value of family and the close bonds he thought he had lost. He felt a renewed strength and courage to embrace new relationships and continue living a meaningful life filled with love and gratitude. Carlos realized that family and friendship were priceless. Sophie was not just a friend, but someone who had taught him to cherish the simple, meaningful moments in life. As Sophie's health stabilized, she and Carlos returned to their usual routines. However, Carlos always reminded her to take care of herself and avoid overexertion. Sophie, with her optimistic and strong-willed nature, would always smile and thank Carlos for his attentive care. To her, Carlos had become an indispensable part of her life, a grandson, a kindred spirit who was always there. They continued their weekend outings, with Carlos taking Sophie to new places in the city or joining activities at the club. These moments brought not only joy but deepened their bond. Sophie felt she had found new meaning in life, while Carlos realized that Sophie had truly become family to him. One day, while Carlos was working at the subway station, he was unexpectedly called to the office by his supervisor. After years of dedication and excellent performance, Carlos was offered a promotion. He was given the opportunity to lead the security team at a larger station, with a higher salary and more benefits. At first, Carlos felt incredibly proud and excited. It was the opportunity he had always dreamed of, a significant step forward in his career. But as he left the office, he began to feel conflicted as he thought of Sophie. The new position would require him to work further away and spend less time with her. He didn't want to leave her alone, especially now that she had become such an important friend he wanted to protect and care for. Carlos thought long and hard and decided to share this with Sophie. He wanted her advice because he knew she would help him make the right decision. That afternoon, Carlos visited Sophie and told her about the job promotion. He spoke about the joy of achieving this milestone but couldn't hide his concern about spending less time with her. "Mrs. Sophie, I don't know what to do. This is a big opportunity, but if I take it, I might have less time to see you." Sophie looked at Carlos, her eyes gentle and understanding. She smiled, took his hand, and said, "Carlos, you are a young man full of ambition and potential. I'm so happy to see you have this opportunity for advancement. Don't let me be a burden in your decision. I will always support you, no matter where you are or what you do." Carlos was deeply moved by her words, but he still felt a pang of sadness. Sophie was more than a friend, she was family, and he didn't want her to feel lonely. He promised himself that even if he took the new job, he would do his best to find time for her. Carlos decided to accept the promotion, but he spent his last days at the old station creating special memories with familiar faces and with Sophie. He promised her that no matter how busy he became, he would always make time for her and be there whenever she needed him. On his last day before transferring to the new branch, Carlos organized a small party at the senior club for Sophie and her new friends. They celebrated together and took photos to commemorate the occasion. In Carlos's heart, he knew his life was about to change, but he was determined to preserve the friendship and bond he shared with Sophie. As time passed, Carlos settled into his new role and responsibilities as a manager at a larger station. The work was more demanding, and the responsibilities heavier, but he never forgot his promise to Sophie. Every week he made time to visit her, helping her stay engaged with club activities and sharing stories about their lives. Each time they met, Sophie filled Carlos with positive energy and affection. They continued to create new, happy memories together, sharing laughter and stories. Carlos realized that no matter how much his job or life changed, Sophie would always be an important anchor in his world. One day, when Carlos visited Sophie, she handed him a letter. It was one she had written long ago, addressed to the most special friend in my life. In the letter, Sophie expressed her deep gratitude to Carlos for coming into her life and bringing her joy and comfort during her later years. She wrote that thanks to Carlos, she had found new meaning in life and no longer felt lonely. Holding the letter, Carlos felt overwhelmed with emotion and gratitude. He realized that what he and Sophie shared wasn't just friendship, it was a genuine and profound connection, like family. He hugged Sophie tightly and told her that she was someone he would always cherish and love. As time went by, Carlos continued to manage his new job at the larger station but never failed to make time for Sophie. They kept their weekend routine, with Carlos taking her to the park, attending outdoor concerts, or simply enjoying a cup of tea together in her cozy apartment. Sophie felt that the happy days of her life had been extended significantly thanks to Carlos being by her side. She realized that despite the hardships and losses she had faced, her life had become truly fulfilling. She wrote more letters, not only to Carlos but also to her new friends at the club, thanking them for bringing joy and meaning to her final years. One day, Carlos decided to organize a surprise party at the club to celebrate Sophie's birthday. Sophie had no idea about the plan and thought it was just a regular gathering. When she walked into the room, she saw her close friends waiting, smiling and singing a cheerful happy birthday. Her eyes welled up with tears of emotion, and she looked at Carlos with deep gratitude. During the party, Carlos stood up to make a speech, looking into the eyes of everyone present, and said, "Today, we're not just celebrating the birthday of a remarkable person, but also honoring a profound friendship and bond. Mrs. Sophie has taught me so much about compassion, patience, and the joy of life. She is not just a friend, but someone I consider family." As Carlos spoke, tears streamed down Sophie's cheeks, but they were tears of happiness. She stood up, took Carlos's hand, and said, "Carlos, you have given me more than I ever hoped for. I am no longer afraid of loneliness or old age because I know I have a wonderful friend." At the end of the party, Carlos gave Sophie a special gift, a photo album filled with the cherished moments they had shared. From their first trip to the seaside, their chess games at the club, to walks in the park. Each page was thoughtfully decorated with heartfelt notes that Carlos had written just for her. Sophie turned each page, her eyes lighting up with joy and happiness. The album was not just a collection of memories, but a testament to the sincere and deep friendship between two people who, though once strangers, had found each other in life. One late autumn afternoon, when golden leaves blanketed the road, Sophie sat by her window, looking out at the world. She felt an unusual sense of peace. Carlos visited as usual, bringing a cup of warm tea and a book she loved. They sat together, talking about life and the simple, yet precious things. Sophie held Carlos's hand, her voice quivering slightly but full of affection. Carlos, if one day I'm no longer here, I want you to remember that you gave me the best days of my life. Don't be sad, for I have lived a full and meaningful life. Carlos couldn't hold back his tears and squeezed her hand tightly. Mrs. Sophie, I will always remember and cherish everything you've taught me. You are a part of my life, and I will never forget that. A few weeks later, Sophie passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving a large void in Carlos's heart and among her friends at the club. She had lived her life fully and departed with a smile, knowing she was no longer alone. Her funeral was small but attended by all who loved her, the people who had become her family in her final years. Carlos stood quietly by her grave, overwhelmed by a sense of loss but also filled with gratitude for everything she had brought into his life. He placed the photo album next to a bouquet of hydrangeas, her favorite flower, and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Sophie. I will continue to live, carrying your lessons and love in my heart." Carlos's life carried on with work and new relationships, but he always held the memory of Sophie close as a source of inspiration. The lessons she had imparted about kindness, compassion, and finding joy in simple things became a legacy he treasured and passed on to those around him. It seems there was an issue retrieving the current trending keywords online. However, popular and trending keywords often relate to major global events, trending topics on social media, and hot search terms in news, entertainment, or technology. If you are looking for specific trending keywords, you might want to check sources like Google Trends, Twitter trending topics, or news websites for real-time updates.